Hello, I'm Anika from Made to Sew. In this video, we're going to be looking at how to move the bust apex of a princess seam to raise it or lower it, or move it closer to the center front or to the side seam so that it's in the right location for your individual figure. Now, a princess seam is a seam that comes from the armhole or from the shoulder and travels down or near the fullest part of your bust. This bodice here has a princess seam. Now, you may have made up a sample, or you may already know that generally you find the bust apex is in the wrong place on your patterns. So the bust apex is the fullest part of the bust. And if this is in the wrong place for you, you'll find that the curve of the princess seam is in the wrong place for your shape. So you're going to need to move it. The first thing that you're going to need to do is to find the location of your bust apex, the fullest part of your bust. And I have a tutorial that shows you how to do that. You can click on the link now to watch it, or find it in the description box below. You'll then need to compare that to the bust apex placement on your pattern. Again, I have a tutorial that shows you how to find the bust apex placement on your individual pattern. And I'll pop a link to that here as well. Once you know the placement of your apex and the placement of the patterns, you'll be able to find the difference, whether you need to raise or lower the apex, or move it perhaps closer to the center front or closer to the side seam. In this tutorial, we will first look at how to raise or lower the bust apex, and then at the end, I'll briefly talk about moving that fullest part of the curve in both directions. So grab your pattern, get your measurements taken, and we can begin. To begin this tutorial, I've gone ahead and traced out my pattern pieces. So I've traced out my bodice front and my side bodice. Now, your princess seam may be finishing into the armhole like mine is here, or it may be coming into the shoulder. It doesn't matter. You can follow the method that I'm sharing with you here for either option. So I've gone ahead and I've just traced my outside lines of the pattern, as well as my grain lines, my bust apex, which is clear on my front pattern here, by a cross and then a circle. You may not have a bust apex like this. You may simply have a line that shows you where the bust line is designed to be on your pattern. And I've also labeled my pattern with the pattern that it is, the size and the pieces, so the front and the side front. Now, I would recommend that you draw your stitching lines onto the pattern, simply because as we make this adjustment, I think it's easier to be working on blending your stitching lines back in rather than the outside edge of your pattern, the cut line. So I'm drawing on my stitching lines here. I know my seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch, 1.5 centimeters. You can work in a nice sharp pencil. I am using this thicker marker because it's clearer for you to see. So I'm just doing that princess seam edge of my side front, and I'll do the princess seam edge of my front pattern as well. Of course, the first thing is to work out where that bust apex needs to move to, and therefore I would recommend that you watch a couple of other tutorials that I have on how to find your bust apex, and of course then how to measure the pattern to work out what the pattern bust apex position measures, and therefore what adjustment that you will need. We're going to grab a ruler and we're going to draw a box around the bust apex part of our pattern. So we can see the bust apex on our front pattern here nice and clearly. And we know that on a princess seam, the bust apex is determined by the fullest part of the curve. We could, if we wanted to, put the pattern pieces on top of one another. We could match up the stitching lines, match the notches, and we could easily see about where that bust apex is. Now, what we want to do is we want to draw a box that surrounds the fullest part of that bust apex. So, and you want it to be very similar on both the side front and the front. So I'm going to use my notches as a marker here. So I'm going to use this bottom notch, and I'm going to draw a horizontal line that is at a right angle to my grain line. So I'm using my ruler here to check my grain line, and I'm going to draw a line across in my green pen here. Now I can easily extend my grain line, because I think it's easier if you use that as a point. And then I'm going to draw a horizontal line parallel to my grain line that is above that top notch. And then finally, we need to draw another line. I'm just going to extend this one a little bit. That connects the two lines together. In this example, I'm going to use my grain line again to line my ruler up. So I'm going to do the width of my ruler, 5 centimeters, 2 inches. And now what we're going to do is we're going to cut out this section. So I'm going to cut along the line that's at the base of that notch, along the line that's at the top of the notch, and down this line here. So we're relieving that full part of the bust. And of course, if your edge of your paper isn't here, you could again draw another line as long as it was larger than the pattern piece. And again, I did that one parallel to my grain line, just like that. Okay, so now I have this little box. And the great thing about this box is that I can simply lower it and I can simply raise it. And so this is what we're going to do. We can lower it, we can raise it. Should you require, you can move it out and you can move it in. Now we're just going to move this to one side a second, and I'm going to draw another box around my front in exactly the same location. I'm going to go with the bottom of this notch here, and that has got to be at a right angle to my grain line or my center front. And I'm going to do another one at the top of this notch. Again, a right angle to my grain line or center front. Now, I also need to have a vertical line. So again, I could probably use the ruler lined up with the edge of my pattern to draw that in place. Just connect that. And of course, I could also draw myself another line here. It just needs to be a box where both of the vertical lines are parallel to your grain line or center front in this case, and my horizontal lines are at a right angle to that. So again, I'm coming in from the edge and I'm cutting across and cutting across on the lines. I will cut up the vertical line to release this section. And it doesn't matter if you've got a bit of paper on the edge, but if you want a neater finish, we could cut that away as well. So if you've already cut out your pattern pieces, it doesn't really matter. You're just not going to have a square edge to this side of the pattern. That's fine. I think it's easier if you do leave a bit of paper around, because we're going to be blending this in once we've done our adjustment. I'm going to presume for this tutorial that you're going to want to lower your bust apex, and you're wanting to lower it by 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch. So what I'm going to do here, it doesn't matter if you begin with the front or with the side front, is this bottom horizontal line that we've drawn. I now want that to be 2 centimeters, 3/4 of an inch lower. So using my ruler, I'm going to draw that in with my red pen. Now I also want to give me a bit of help, this vertical line here to be extended. Again, just making sure that this is nice and straight, parallel to that center front or grain line. And then I can take my little square, and rather than positioning it back in where it is, I can shift it down. So I'm not going to be changing the position that it is on this vertical line, because for this example, we're not actually moving the location of the princess seam on the body, as in moving it towards the side or moving it towards the center front. We're just lowering that shape so that it fits our bust apex better. So now I can grab some tape, and I'm going to tape this down, lining up the vertical and the horizontal edges. And then we need to do exactly the same for our side front. So whatever we do to the front needs to happen to the side front. So again, my horizontal bottom line, I'm going to draw or measure 2 centimeters lower, 3/4 of an inch. And I'm also going to extend that vertical line. Then I can take my little piece, and rather than its original location, I'm keeping the vertical line the same and moving it down to meet the new horizontal line. Now, we're going to need a little bit of scrap paper to fill in the gaps, and then we're going to need to reblend the shape of our seam. So now I've got my little scrap of paper and I can fill in that gap. And I'm then going to want to reshape my princess seam. I'm going to need to have my French curve to hand. And what you'll find here is I would recommend that you work with your stitching line, which is why I asked you to draw that on. I think it's easier to get the stitching line right, and then you can re-add your seam allowances. If you have lowered your princess seam like we've done here, I wouldn't recommend that you start with that higher point there. You're going to want to go from this lower point back up. If you go with the higher point, you'll probably end up with too much fabric in this area because the fullness of your bust is slightly lower. Then at the bottom edge here, we can be curving that back in as well. I'm just drawing that on so that I can take a look. I may just want to dip that in a little bit more, I think. On that top edge, I think I'll go with the inner line there. So sometimes it is a case of sketching it in rather than using your French curve. You can't always achieve what you want with that. Now, once I have drawn in my new shape, I would go back to re-adding my seam allowances. So that is my side front done and lowered. I would need to finish my center front as well. So we've got a little scrap of paper coming in here so that we can stick this down, and then we'll grab curve probably so that we can work with this. So this bottom edge looks pretty good here. It's just the top edge that we need to worry about. I would again suggest that we go with this inner seam allowance here because again, you're probably going to have less fullness in this area because we've lowered the bust. So something like that as our stitching line. So I can now add my seam allowances on the front. And the final thing that I would need to do with these two pattern pieces, bar cut them out, is to true my seams and move my notches if I need to. So from the bottom, we want to true from the bottom where the seam allowances meet to the first notch. So we can position the two pieces on top of one another and check that that first notch is matching up, which it is. Then we would go from the top, so the seam allowance is at the top, to that second notch. And my second notch is also matching up. And then of course you can true the rest of the shape of your princess seam. One thing to note is that I personally draft my princess seams without any ease, so they're the same size, they match together perfectly. But some pattern designers prefer to have a little bit of difference in their princess seams, or a bit of ease. So if in doubt, go back to your original pattern, true them together to see what the differences are in the seams. And then of course you would copy that when you're doing this now. I do have a more detailed tutorial on how to true your seams together. I'll pop a link to it here and in the description box below if you would like to watch it. So hopefully it's clear how we lower or raise our bust apex. And we did this by the 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch. Let's take a quick look at using the same method to change the position of the bust apex slightly. Let's just say for this example that we wanted to move the princess seam more towards the front of the body by 1.5 centimeters, 5/8 of an inch. We would take the side front piece and we would keep the horizontal lines matching up and move it over by 1.5 centimeters. Of course, you're welcome to add in a scrap of paper and measure this, or use your ruler like I'm doing. Now for the front pattern piece, we would do exactly the same. We would draw a line 1.5 centimeters, 5/8 away from the vertical line and keep the horizontal lines the same. Then we would just need to blend back in our stitching lines. We're presuming for this adjustment, we're keeping the top and the bottom stitching lines the same. We're only moving the curve. This would mean that we need to use this square to dictate how we blend back in. Once you've blended your stitching lines, you would of course re-add your seam allowances. True your pattern and check that the notches are in the right place. I would recommend that you create a sample garment when you move or alter the placement of the bust apex to make sure that it's in the right place for you. I would now need to cut away my new shapes and make up my sample. Of course, if I wish to move my princess seam towards the side seam, I would do the exact opposite. Move this center front panel towards the side seam and move my side front box towards the side seam as well. I really hope you've learned something new in this tutorial. Thank you for watching and see you soon.